This video, we're going to be going over changes in the cardiac conduction system. So cardio means relating to the heart, vascular relates to the vessels. In future content, when we go over the cardiorespiratory system, we'll be talking about the lungs. Anytime you hear the word pulmonary, that's going to be related to the lungs or to breathing. So the first objective we're going to do today is we're going to recall the passage of blood through the basic structures of the heart. Now, if you've seen lesson 1, you should already be fairly familiar with this, but if you haven't already, you need to check that one out because that'll help this video make much more sense. So starting at the vena cava, you need to be able to state the structures a red blood cell would pass through on the journey of the heart. In the last lesson, I gave you a very easy tip for first labeling the heart, which is to get the ventricles identified first. The easiest ways to do this is because this chamber of the heart, it looks like you can kind of draw a V in it. And we know the atria sit on top of the ventricles, so it's very easy to identify those as well. It's probably a bit of a stretch to say the top chambers of the heart look like they could house the letter A, but it is a useful way of remembering that the atria are on the top and the ventricles are at the bottom. We know that deoxygenated blood is going to enter through the right side of the heart, and the first place that it's going to enter once it's gone through the vena cava is the right atrium. An easy way of remembering the first valve that you're going to encounter is that you try before you buy. This means that the first valve you're going to encounter is the tricuspid valve. So we've got the vena cava, the right atrium, and the tricuspid valve. Remember, the importance of valves is to ensure that blood only flows in one direction. That's what makes you beautiful. We don't want blood flowing back down the body, so to speak. After the right ventricle, we have the pulmonary valve and the pulmonary artery. So this is number 5 and 6. We should know that from the introduction to this lesson that when we're talking about pulmonary, we're talking about breathing, and that's going to require sending blood to the lungs. So the pulmonary artery is going to take blood away from the heart and towards the lungs. Remember, arteries away. Arteries take blood away. Pulmonary means breathing, so in order to breathe better, we need blood to get oxygenated at the lungs. Blood's going to come back through the heart through something known as the pulmonary vein. So if arteries take blood away from the heart, veins take blood towards the heart. Pulmonary relates to breathing, so if blood has just gone to the lungs, it's going to come back from the lungs via the pulmonary vein, and the first chamber it's going to enter after that is the left atrium. So that's number 8. The next thing we're going to encounter is the bicuspid valve. Sometimes it can be confusing because this is also known as the mitral valve. The bicuspid valve is located between the left atrium and the left ventricle, whereas the tricuspid valve is located between the right atrium and the right ventricle. After that, the blood is going to enter the left ventricle. This is the thickest ventricle, even though it doesn't look like it on my diagram. Probably should have picked a better one. But the left ventricle is drawn thicker because it is needing to be a stronger pump. The left ventricle pumps blood all around the body, whereas the right ventricle, we've just discussed, pumps blood to the lungs. Next, it's going to go into the largest artery of the body, which is the aorta. So your vena cava is the largest vein of the body. That brings blood back, deoxygenated blood back into the heart. And the aorta, the largest artery, which is number 11 on our diagram, is the largest artery. If you're struggling with that, or if that felt too quick for you, then there's a slower paced version in lesson 1, which covers the passage of blood through the heart. Today's lesson, we're going to focus on how electrical impulses travel through the heart. And one easy thing to help us remember this is a memory tool or a mnemonic, but I'd like you to think about how you might make things memorable for you. Here's a TED Talk on how to make things more memorable.
For something to be really memorable, it needs to be intellectually confounding or challenging, right? And it also has to target your emotions on a very, very extreme level.
So if we want things to be memorable, they need to be intellectually confounding, which is why I like to ask questions and why you should follow your curiosity when it comes to A-level PE, because that's going to help you memorize things a lot better. Research I was coming across the other day basically asked people to rank how curious they were compared to a particular topic, and they then ranked how well they've remembered the answers. So if something provokes your curiosity, then research that further because it will help you understand more about the topic.
For something
So we're now going to move on to the mnemonic that I like to remember, the cardiac conduction system. But the first letters of each of the places that the electrical impulse travels to and from are written on the board. And I'm going to do a little thought experiment to explain how I remember it. So Sally, this first picture here, was a Coronation Street character.
I officially open this allotment.
I used to remember how mind-numbing it was that my brother would want to watch Coronation Street, and that helps me remember the S, or Sally in this case, is the first letter of where the electrical impulse is going to start. So the second thing in my mnemonic is always. So Sally always aims balls past Vicky. So again, the two characters that I'm using here, one made me remember how mind-numbingly boring Coronation Street was, and the other was a character in a controversial comedy sketch show that is probably would be cancelled if it was on show today. But each of those letters stand for a structure in the heart that helps to transmit the electrical impulse. People think with, for example, machines that deliver CPR, that the electrical impulse is designed to basically restart the heart. However, normally when people run into difficulties with the heart, their impulse actually needs to be restarted, and that's what a defibrillator helps to do. But now let's talk about each of those steps in the cardiac conduction system in detail. So the first step is the sinoatrial node. Sino means involved in the sinus node, and atrial simply means relating to the atria. Now, if you look at this diagram carefully, you should be able to work out roughly in the heart where it's located. The unique thing about cardiac muscle is that it's myogenic. What this means is it has the capacity to generate its own impulses. This makes cardiac muscle unique compared to, say, skeletal muscle, and we're going to come back to that in more detail in a second. But looking at the diagram that I've chosen for the sinoatrial node, you should be able to work out that it's in the right atria. Now, you should also have worked out what's unique about cardiac muscle compared to, say, your biceps.
2 tickets to the gun show.
So what is it that makes myogenic cardiac muscle different compared to skeletal muscle? That is that because it's myogenic, that means it can transmit its own impulses. It doesn't require the brain in order to tell the heart to work. Now, if we compare this to, for example, the biceps need information from the brain and the spinal cord in order to contract. We're going to learn more about the nervous system or the neuromuscular system in later content, but neuro relates to nerves, muscular relates to obviously the muscles. So in the neuromuscular system, we're going to learn how the nerves talk to the muscles and get them to fire. So the sinoatrial node can also be thought of as the pacemaker of the heart. So when the sinoatrial node transmits the electrical impulse, it's almost like a wave of electrical activity being transmitted throughout the heart, but it starts in the sinoatrial node. The next thing that's going to happen is something called atrial systole. Remember, systole is when the heart contracts, so when the heart is speeding up. Diastole, which will become more important in future content, is when the heart relaxes to fill with blood. Now, if we're talking about atrial systole, that means that the specific part of the heart that is contracting is the two upper chambers, known as the atrium. When they contract, they force blood into the ventricles. The next place that the electrical impulse travels to is something called the Atrioventricular node. So atrio just means we're talking about the atrias, and ventricular just means relating to the ventricles. Now, the atrioventricular node transmits the electrical impulse between the upper and lower chambers of the heart. So if we know what the words mean, it kind of gives us a hint to what the atrioventricular node does. And the next part of the heart we're going to talk about is located in the septum of the heart. Remember, when we did the passage of blood lesson, we learned that the septum separates the heart. So the next thing in the heart that we're going to learn about is the bundle of His. But before we get there, I want you to think about why the atrioventricular node might delay the transmission of the cardiac impulse for approximately 0.1 of a second. Why should there be a delay in the impulses? This has to do with what's come before. So the blood in the atria is emptying after the sinoatrial node transmits the impulse. But the reason why the atrioventricular node delays the transmission is to allow the blood to fully clear out of the atria, or clear as much as possible, before the next step in the chain happens. So the next step is something called the bundle of His. This is a collection of heart muscle cells that are transmitting electrical impulses from the atrioventricular node via something called the bundle branches, which is the yellow lines you can see at the bottom. Now, sometimes structures in the body have names which are very literal. For example, sino, meaning of the sinus node, atrial, relating to the atria, or atrioventricular, relating to the atria and the ventricles. The bundle of His doesn't have a logical name. It was named after the scientist who first discovered the physical link that electrically bridges the atria, so the top parts of the heart, and the ventricles. And this guy's name was William His Jr. Now, what was interesting is he was the first person to cut through the middle of the heart, the septum, to discover this bundle of His. So something I found out when I was looking into this topic is that the bundle of His was discovered 54 years after the Purkinje Fibres. Now, this was because no one had looked at the heart and thought, let's cut right through the thick septum in the middle. Now, the next thing is the Purkinje Fibres, also named after the scientist who discovered them. The Purkinje Fibres help the ventricles to contract. So the Purkinje Fibres are at the bottom of the ventricles, and they are what causes the ventricles to contract. Now, if atrial systole means that the atria are going to contract and eject blood out of the atria, then ventricular systole, which is the last step in the cardiac conduction system, means that the ventricles are going to contract and they will eject with blood. Now, if you watched lesson 1 on the passage of blood, you should know where the right ventricle is going to take blood to and where the left ventricle is going to take blood to. In fact, if you missed it, you can even skip back to earlier in this lesson itself to find out. So we know SAABP V is how we remember how electrical impulses travel through the heart. For example, Sally always aims balls past Vicky. That's the first letter of each of the structures. And there they are again, a quick recap. You can make your own mnemonic if you prefer, but make it as creative as possible. Try and have as much emotion in it as possible, because you're much more likely to remember emotions associated with stuff like humour or pain than you are stuff that is a bit boring. Now we're going to talk about 3 receptors which impact heart rate. So what I want you to do is have a look at these 4 pictures, and I want you to think about what kinds of things that the body might need to change the heart rate in response to. What might receptors need to be able to detect, and why might they have to change the heart rate as a result? This isn't an exhaustive list, so for example, there are other things that the heart rate might respond to which isn't included in these pictures, which we'll touch on later in the lesson. So the first one, you might have guessed it, it's carbon dioxide. Anytime there is a change in carbon dioxide, this is going to make the blood more acidic. If it is more acidic, then we're going to need to deliver oxygen to the working muscles to try and neutralize this acidity and help us deal with this waste product. The second one is movement, or more specifically joint positioning. So when we move, we need obviously the heart rate to increase to send oxygenated blood to the working muscles. The penultimate one is blood pressure. So what is happening to the heart rate when blood pressure either increases or decreases? Now let's talk about the receptors that detect these things. So the easy way of remembering these is the first letter and understanding the root word. So chemoreceptors kind of sounds like the word chemical. They are designed to detect increases in carbon dioxide, and specifically carbon dioxide in the blood. The places that have these chemoreceptors are the carotid arteries and the aortic arch. These are arteries in the neck, and they help detect increases in carbon dioxide. Anytime our carbon dioxide is increased, then we need to increase the heart rate to get oxygen to that working muscle to help counteract that. The next set of receptors that we have are receptors called proprioceptors. Now, proprio means one's own, seption or septors means perception. So proprioceptors literally translates to one's own perception. So it's your perception of where your body is in time and space. Proprioceptors detect the positioning and movement of joints and muscles. And because they detect positioning of joints and muscles, they're located in nerve endings that are in muscles, tendons, and joints. So these receptors help sense how much movement is going on. The more movement that's happening, the more you're going to need oxygenated blood in that area. Now remember, the sympathetic nervous system is designed to help speed up the heart rate. So when proprioceptors detect that there's an increase in muscle movement when we start exercising, they're going to send signals to the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system is designed to speed up heart rate and speed up breathing. So when the signals are sent from the sympathetic nervous system, these are going to go to the sinoatrial node. Remember, the sinoatrial node is known as the pacemaker of the heart. So this is what's going to increase our heart rate. If, however, we want the proprioceptors are detecting a decrease in movement, this is when the parasympathetic nervous system is going to stimulate the sinoatrial node, telling the heart rate to decrease. So sympathetic nervous system speeds up, the parasympathetic slows down. So for example, when we're resting and digesting, that's when the parasympathetic nervous system is important. So the B is for baroreceptors, or which conveniently is the one that helps us regulate our heart rate in response to blood pressure. So when our blood pressure is increasing, we want to actually bring the heart rate back down to try and find a level of homeostasis or balance within the body. We don't want a high blood pressure and a high heart rate. Now, baroreceptors, these are in nerve endings which respond to the stretching of the arterial wall. So the walls of the arteries, when there is an increase in blood pressure detected in these arteries, they will stretch more. Now, when they stretch more, this is going to force the baroreceptors to signal that there needs to be a decrease in heart rate. So when there's a decrease in the blood pressure, this will lead to a decrease in the level of stretch on the arterial walls. Remember, as more blood flows through the artery walls, that's going to stretch the arteries. When there's less blood, there's going to be less stretch. We don't want the heart to slow down during exercise. So initially, the baroreceptors have something called a set point. So for example, heart rate will increase to a certain point because we don't want it to slow down in exercise. But if it gets too high, the baroreceptors, which detect changes in blood pressure, are going to eventually bring that down. And baroreceptors also signal to a part of the brain called the Medulla Oblongata. This is a part of the brain that is known as the control center because it controls our breathing and our heart rate. So let's have a quick recap. I want you to think about what the receptors are going to force the heart rate to do when they detect increases in carbon dioxide, movement, and blood pressure. So if you've remembered correctly, when the chemoreceptors detect an increase in carbon dioxide, they're actually going to increase the heart rate. So they're going to increase the heart rate because carbon dioxide is acidic. Oxygen helps neutralize that acidic carbon dioxide, and it also helps rid the muscles of waste products. So chemoreceptors detect an increase in carbon dioxide and they increase the heart rate. Proprioceptors, which detect an increase in or a change in joint positioning or movement, they are going to cause the heart rate to increase. So when we're moving more, we obviously need our heart rate to go up so we can get more oxygen to the working muscles. Finally, the baroreceptors, they detect an increase in blood pressure. When blood pressure goes beyond the set point, that's when it's going to want to bring blood pressure back down. to start bringing changes in the heart rate. But what other changes might the heart rate need to respond to? Now, I remember when I had my first boxing fight, and I said to a teammate of mine, it must be a huge adrenaline rush when you have a fight. He said the biggest adrenaline rush is actually when you're in the ring, when you're walking to the ring itself. Your body is preparing you to have a fight, and if you've heard of fight or flight, you'll know that the sympathetic nervous system is going to speed up your heart rate, and you're going to get a massive release of something called adrenaline, which is your fight or flight hormone. You're also going to have changes in heart rate when there is a higher temperature. So higher temperatures cause cells to work harder in order to maintain the same level of function. So that means those cells need more oxygen, and to get more oxygen, the heart rate has to increase. The final change that receptors need to respond to is stretch. So for example, if you've ever tried some really advanced mobility work, and for example you hold a hard stretch for long enough, you might notice that your heart rate starts to go up because your body isn't prepared for that stretch. And the receptors that detect these changes, you've got thermoreceptors detecting changes in heat, and something called muscle spindles that detect changes in the rate of stretch. Adrenaline is a key hormonal change that the heart responds to. And finally, we've got receptors we've already covered, including the chemoreceptors, the baroreceptors, and the proprioceptors. Now here's a challenge question. In the lungs, we have something called muscle spindles. Remember from the previous slide, muscle spindles are effectively stretch receptors. Now think about your lungs as a balloon. What would happen if the lungs didn't have any muscle spindles? What would happen if there was no way of detecting that the lungs were getting overstretched? The stretch receptors in the lungs, or the muscle spindles, are actually there to prevent overinflation of the lungs. So they send impulses to the expiratory center, down the intercostal nerve to the expiratory muscles, so the abdomen, the internal and intercostals. These are what allow expiration to occur. So they're basically sending signals to the brain to get you to breathe out in order to stop you overinflating the lungs. Finally, we have the medulla oblongata. This is one of the three main mechanisms that controls the rate of impulses from the heart. The other two we've already mentioned. They're the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. When we talk about something being on the periphery, it's on the edge or the outside. So the chemoreceptors, proprioceptors, and baroreceptors, these all talk to the medulla oblongata. This is part of the brain which regulates key processes such as breathing and heart rate. So anytime the receptors are detecting changes in carbon dioxide, joint positioning, or blood pressure, they're going to talk to the medulla oblongata, and the medulla oblongata is going to talk to the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, and it will get a message sent from the brain, the spinal cord, and eventually into the nerve cells themselves. So you've got two nervous systems: your central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord; peripheral nervous system, which is the nerves on the edge. The reason why it's called the central nervous system is because these are the parts of the body that are closest to the middle, and the reason why it's called the peripheral nervous system is because these nerves are on the periphery or the outer edges of the body. So the combination of these three systems, so the medulla oblongata, the central nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system, is what helps coordinate your breathing and your heart rate. The cardiac control center, so this is what controls what happens to the heart, can be stimulated by chemoreceptors that detect carbon dioxide changes, baroreceptors which detect blood pressure changes, and proprioceptors which detect changes in joint positioning. Now remember, the sympathetic nervous system acts to speed up the heart rate, and the way I like to remember the parasympathetic nervous system is this is what slows it down. So if you're trying to park a car, you're going to need to slow it down before you park it. So the sympathetic nervous system speeds up heart rate and breathing rate. The parasympathetic slows it down. So it's going to slow down our heart rate, slow down our breathing rate. So these are the three main mechanisms impacting the rate of impulses. So you've got your medulla oblongata, which is the part of the brain that controls breathing and heart rate, and your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic speeds it up, parasympathetic slows it down, and the medulla oblongata controls exactly what's happening with your breathing and your heart rate. We also have hormonal changes which impact heart rate. I've already mentioned the fight or flight hormone adrenaline. This is a stress hormone released from the sympathetic nervous system during exercise, and it causes the increase in heart rate. It can also be released prior to exercise if you know a stressful event is coming. So finally, you should be able to answer all of these questions using what content we have covered today. The answers I'm going to timestamp in the YouTube description down below. In the next lesson, you're going to learn about stroke volume and the factors that impact that.